right. Thank you guys so much for coming. I know this has been a full day, so the fact that you're still at school is remarkable, and yet not that remarkable because you're always at school. I'm really, really happy to be hosting this event today. The Janika Albers Memorial Lecture on Political Risk is a special event for all of us, and it is an event that has been running for quite a while. It is in memory of our late SAIS Europe alumna, and it's partially supported by the Bologna class of 2006 Tribute Fund. And the lecture is also part of a broader Johns Hopkins SAIS Global Risk Conference, which has been made possible with the general support of Mr. James Anderson, SAIS Europe alumnus and advisory council member, a very dear friend of SAIS as well. So we are really, really happy that we can keep this event going, and not only in the memory of Janika Albers, but also with the people who have been close to SAIS and have been a part of this lecture and this event for a very long time. We're really, really happy to have them all with us today. My name is Janika. I'm professor of risk and international politics and economics here at SAIS, and I am joined for this important conversation that, as I said, has become a tradition for all of us here, and we look forward to it all year long. It's the time when we are not only taking stock of the things that we have been through in the last year, but also, and even more importantly so, we are trying to make predictions about what we're going to see happening in the next year, and see what are the sources of risk that we need to be preparing for. And you're all going into great jobs, but also you're going to write great papers for us to read. So this is also a source of great information for you. And the three people that are here with me today are different types of risk consultants and academics in their own right. So I'm going to start with Oksana Antonenko, who is a visiting fellow at the Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at European University Institute and a global fellow at the Kennan Institute. She was the director for global risk analysis at Controlled Risks until 2023. She's a specialist on regularity and security risks for senior decision makers in private and public sectors, and she covered and continues to cover Europe, including Russia, Turkey, Central Asia, and Africa and the Middle East. So what's left? Australia? No, so no Australia for Oksana. It's great to have Oksana here because she's also an independent consultant now, so that is a different perspective from which she could talk to us. Then we are especially fortunate, not that everyone is special in their own way, to have Erik Jones here. Erik Jones is the one of the funding parents of the global risk degree that we are hosting here at SAIS. Erik was a professor of European studies for a long period of time here. I'm very lucky that he decided to move on because I got to take his place. Those are incredibly large shoes to fill, and I'm trying to do my best. But as you can see, and you don't normally see me this way, I am a little bit nervous. So Erik is now director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at European University Institute, and he is a consultant that also does most of his work that we occasionally do together, based on academic research. So truly the core of what an academic does as well. So that's a different source of specific knowledge. And then we have Preston Keat to my right. Preston Keat has been coming to these things for a very long time. So we always get to ask Preston Keat what he predicted as being wrong the last time he was around, and how he's going to keep checking his predictions. He is managing director and head of political and country risk at UBS. And in this role, he oversees the bank's political and country risk team, which analyzes a broad range of economic and policy themes and coordinates country rating and exposure limits and contributes to stress testing scenario development. And as we were talking previously, your life has become quite interesting since you've also taken over Credit Suisse. But that's not what we're discussing about today. We are more focused on what are the top risks that we should prepare for next year. And just before that, per adesso non si sente nulla. Are we muted? No. No? Okay. So before going further, I just want to share with you one of the initiatives that we are proud to now have here at SAIS. No, you're good. I'm good. And so why not hearing anything from several people? Can you hear us now?
Yes.
No, now we do hear you. It's back. Okay, good. It was your fault, not ours, for the record. Right, so we're gonna start with Preston, Keat, and then we're gonna take it from there.
Thank you, Veronica. So just 5 quick slides here. First one is a survey that we did earlier this year.
I think one of these machines needs to be muted.
This is muted. You need to.
How's it now? Much better, yeah. All right. Okay.
We're getting there.
Gradually, yeah. So a survey that we did earlier this year. I won't go into the details of the methodology, but I'm happy to discuss offline if people are interested. You know, we posited a list of just one of these word cloud exercises about how the world used to work, and then in the traditional world, and then we were polling people about how the world works now. What is the contemporary reality? And these were the 5 top results, right? So the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and fragmented, right? So this means the risky world, and nothing goes to plan, and forecasting becomes incredibly difficult in this environment, but this is the environment that we live in.
And the first one is a fantasy world, right? Rational, linear, simple, and stable.
This is the year 2000, I think, right? Prior to 9/11, right? Globalization was humming along, everything worked fine, economies were great. Political risk wasn't really even a field at the time, right? Nascent field, but yeah. This is a fantasy for the foreseeable future. Next slide.
Oh, just click the mouse on the screen to regain control.
Okay.
There, now you have control.
Okay. So I always have to do my pitch for the SAIS skill set, right? And so doing a bit of research, realized that this institution was founded in the mid-1940s and went just as the Cold War was emerging. And through that next period, the skill set that people here developed was, becoming expert analysts of the Cold War, whether that's geopolitics or, nuclear deterrence theory or development theory, et cetera. Then we entered a period of what is generally referred to as hyperglobalization. So the cross-border flows of goods, services, people, information, international investments, supply chains. And SAIS students were incredibly well prepared to deal with that, with the addition of finance, economics, political economy, data analysis, and so on. And say now we're in an era that I would refer to as strategic competition. It doesn't mean that these other two titles are no longer relevant, but now we just added a whole entire additional layer with this, let's say reemergence of geopolitics. And again, here, I think the skill set you're getting in forecasting and risk management, in climate, energy, cyber technology is, I think, sort of meeting the moment in terms of what the next set of challenges are for risk analysis and forecasting. So again, a brilliant place to be. But it's also a bit of a tricky spot for the Western world, right? So I was looking at the G7 leaders' approval ratings recently, right? And I guess the Italian leader Meloni is doing the best, but still under 50%. People are so concerned about Biden's ratings. He's only at 38%, but compared to G7 peers, he's looking pretty good, right? And I think that one of the real challenges here is that, so we're in an environment where we have, reducing, but what has been persistently high inflation, very, limited economic growth, and just this reemergence of geopolitics, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, or this, ongoing US-China tensions, right? So the state of the world, both economically and geopolitically, appears to be just more and more challenging. So again, your skill set is, I think, perfectly positioned to capture this in an interdisciplinary way that sort of traditional departments would just miss out on. End of SAIS sales pitch.
Thank you.
Okay. The most recent risk to come onto the radar, it's been on there for, every 6 or 7 years for the last, 50 years, but the Middle East. And the question, I can get asked all kinds of questions about, Gaza, spillover to Hezbollah in the north, and potential, conflict in the West Bank, spillover to Iran. All those things are out there. There's certainly risks. I'm not overly worried about the spillover parts of them, outside of Gaza. But I think the next order question is really, under what circumstances can we have any kind of stable peace in the Middle East? And as I came up with let's say a simple heuristic to think about this, this is what I came up with. So you have what is possible given the current political configurations in Israel, the West Bank, and in Gaza. And then here's what you have, what is necessary in order to come to some sort of stable, lasting accommodation. And you can tell that they don't overlap at all. So your Venn diagram is not really working. So as a risk manager, you say this is quite bad, really problematic. And so risk managers are quite good at highlighting why things won't work and why there are challenges. One of my things I've recently been doing at the end of each talk is highlighting a few positive things about the current environment. So here's one on this. So if that was the state of the world 6 weeks ago, the possible and the necessary in no way overlapped. I still think they don't overlap, but we're now in a position where you could think forward over the next few years, and the political situation domestically in each of these places could be quite substantially different. And in that environment, there's I think a hypothetical pathway to some better outcomes, because it had just been frozen with no progress basically for the last decade, particularly in the last 18 months where it's gotten worse. But I think that this, I don't want to say this is an opportunity, but there could be a new political equilibrium or several new political equilibriums in these different areas. All right, another cartoon. So I think much of the media coverage in Ukraine, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is focused on sort of how badly the Ukrainian latest counteroffensive went over the summer and into the fall, right? So a lot of concern, despondency, lack of progress, et cetera. The word stalemate being thrown around. I don't quite agree with that word, but the mood is not, let's say, positive if you're rooting for Ukraine here. But I think if you take a step back, there are basically three legs to this chair, or whatever metaphor you want to do, three sides to the triangle. And you think about what the Western objectives are here. Let's say, so what NATO's objectives are here. And then the first was to deny Russia its core war aims. That has happened. They have not toppled the government in Kiev, and it's still a functioning state with a functioning government that Russia does not control. Number two, remember in the early days there was a lot of concern about broader escalation to the Baltics, to Moldova, to Romania, to Central Asia, et cetera, et cetera. That has basically been contained. And there's not been direct interaction between NATO forces and Russian forces, which is links into the whole deterrence theory narrative. So that has been a relative success. Where there hasn't been success is Ukraine regaining its territory, right? And will they ever do that in full? I'm skeptical. But I think the real thing to focus on over the next 2 to 3 years is independent of winning the war at the tactical level and where the border is can Ukraine win the peace? So if you asked me 2.5 years ago, would Ukraine have a plausible pathway to joining the EU and NATO in the next decade? I would say no. And today I would say yes. It'll be difficult, quite challenging, but I still think there's an optimistic pathway for Ukraine in spite of all the nastiness that we're experiencing right now. Sergey might disagree, but we'll see. Okay, finally, this is the biggest risk out there. Everyone's talking about it, and there's, it's too early to tell much, but we have, an election in the US. You can list the areas where there might be potentially higher uncertainty or potentially radical policy change if Donald Trump wins re-election. It's the future of NATO, future of aid for Ukraine, the US-China relationship, US approach to climate change, or abandonment potentially of its current approach. And then you have a whole range of concerns about government institutions, which you can all imagine what those are. So as an analyst, my forecast would be, in spite of these polls recently, that shows Trump basically leading in most of the key swing states. I think, well, first of all, of course, it's too early to tell, but that's not an acceptable answer if someone asks you for a forecast. So I would just say a couple things. I think that these, polls tend to be, or let's say, first-term presidents in the U.S. tend to poll at around 40% at this point, whether it's, whether it's W. Bush, whether it's Obama, whether it's Clinton. There's so many presidents who won re-election. So Biden at 38 to 40% is not a disaster right now, historically. I think also, a lot of these polls right now are essentially a snapshot of the state of the world, not the performance of the government, right? So there's a whole, so people aren't saying I prefer Donald Trump or Joe Biden. They're saying, wow, inflation is still high, the growth outlook is poor, geopolitics is chaotic. I don't feel happy, right? Now, come November, and you're forced with a one-to-one choice or decision, choosing between Trump and Biden. I mean, so Biden might be unpopular, but Trump is, I think, at least as unpopular. So these numbers don't reflect Trump's strength; they reflect, I think, decline by Biden. And then I would say, finally, from the Democrats' perspective, these last few weeks have been, relatively solid, right? So solid victories in Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, with an abortion referendum on the ballot. So I think that the Democratic Party versus the Republicans is feeling pretty good right now in terms of its strength. It's just that the president's polling numbers are lagging. So that's my way of saying to all the people, internal constituents that I talk to, it's like, don't panic if you're concerned about these things on the left. And I think if people in markets, it's not Trump or not Trump, it's just uncertainty about what any presidency might bring. So it's not that people think the Democrats or Republicans are better, but if one side produces additional uncertainty, and that's not ideal for investment, right? So I think that's the concern. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preston. Before Sergey gets to answer, I think Oksana wants to take you up on a couple of those. But first, opening remarks on what you think are the forthcoming risks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you, SAIS, for inviting me back. It's great to be here and great to see so many young people interested in studying risk. I think you're doing the right thing. It's a good career prospect and opportunity, so congratulations. The second thing to say is an introduction. I'm really happy this year because I now can present my own views on the top 5 risks, because over the last 5 years I worked with a team of about 100 political analysts, and we had to always, negotiate, which risks are more important and are less important. So the 5 risks were not always my own. Now I'm quite liberated, and I can actually say what exactly I think, whether it's right or wrong. So maybe give you like a quick headlines, and I think hopefully we'll have a lot of discussion afterwards. So my number 1 risk for next year, I would briefly call elections. So next year we have, I think, more than 2 billion people going to elections. So it's not just US elections, and Preston is right, but there's elections in Taiwan, there is elections in India. There's very important European elections to the European Parliament. Usually, those elections are not noticed, but in the current environment where we have populist parties, leading pretty much across the board in Europe, so we might have a very, very different looking European Parliament after those elections. And of course, the European Parliament will be quite decisive in the shape of the next European Union, European Commission, which is, of course, is going to be incredibly important, not least for Ukraine, but other, foreign policy issues. And I think it is not an unimaginable prospect that AfD might be the largest party emerging in the European elections in Germany, and not to speak about where we are now in the Netherlands and many other countries in Europe. So elections, generally speaking, the world is going to look very different after all of those elections are over, very different. And it's global coincidence that all the key elections are happening in 1 year, I think is quite unusual, particularly in the environment of general global instability. So, and again, I would watch Taiwan elections very carefully, and what that might mean both for China, but also US-China relations. The second big headline is war. I think you do not need to be reminded that we are now living in a world where war is becoming more of a routine event and something out of the ordinary. I mean, we now have a war in Europe going on for 2 years, and there is no end in sight, certainly not going to finish next year. We now have the war in the Middle East, again, potentially with a very long duration. And I think, in my view, that next year will be the year when the war would be even more normalized. And of course, we are having lots of potential scenarios that we can talk about, but I would say the war risk nowadays is becoming extremely important and something to watch all across the world. And I would say Europe in particular. And I still think that this kind of positive perspective that the spillovers and from the Russia-Ukraine war have been contained. I think it's a bit of a wishful thinking in my view. I think we are already in the environment of very substantial spillovers. If we look at the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and if we are looking at overall in what the Russia's war aims are at the moment, clearly my argument is that Russia is no longer fighting a war for territorial conquest in Ukraine. I think it is fighting very much a proxy war with the West, and Russia's war games are no longer control of Kiev, but seeing, Western coalition falling apart and Russia emerging as a quite a decisive player in the European security content in the long run. At the moment, it's not clear whether those aims can be achieved, but if we have a coincidence of, Trump returning back to the White House and quite substantial positive performance of the populists in Europe, I think it is not an inconceivable prospect, although terrifying. The third big headline is fragmentation. And again, this trend towards global fragmentation, kind of geopolitical fragmentation of the global order, is not new. It has been emerging now over several years. But I think next year will be quite decisive in understanding what this fragmentation is going to, what shape this fragmentation is going to take. I mean, I think the general view, kind of if you look at the global perspective here, whether we are moving towards a chaotic fragmentation, in which there will not be kind of centers of power emerging in any kind of structured way, but we will see more of a kind of disintegration of the global order into this kind of chaotic fragmentation, or whether we are moving towards a fragmentation with this kind of regional powers or blocks, emerging that are able and willing to coordinate their, vital interests and foreign policy objectives. So far, there is a lot of uncertainty over it, but I think next year, with again a set of elections and ultimately, with the impact on whether the West is going to survive out of this electoral cycle as a substantial, united bloc, so to speak, geopolitically, globally. I think we'll decide to a large extent whether we will have a chaotic fragmentation or fragmentation based on the new blocks emerging. Another big headline is technology. Again, I think there is a general expectations among the sort of technology experts, and I'm not one of them, but I certainly consume a lot of information about it, is that we will see some quite major breakthroughs already next year around, new generation AI, as well as, potentially on a number of other, critically important technologies. Maybe, I mean, at least if we listen to, the recent AI summit that or event which took place in the UK, chaired by Prime Minister Sunak, the idea that we will not have, global consensus about regulation of technology, while at the same time we are standing on the verge of the major technological breakthroughs, can potentially manifest themselves already with very substantial risks emerging. And those risks, as we've seen, are not so far being effectively managed through global regulation. And the final point is another headline, I would say, overload. And this is maybe something in a bit more micro level. If you look at how the risks are being managed, both by the governments, but also by business. Governments, I would argue, the multiplicity of risks, this kind of perma-crisis that we are now living in, have only entrenched what I call a groupthink. When I was working in consulting world, we did quite a lot of red teaming exercises for different, governments and foreign ministries, trying to really push and question the assumptions behind the particular, policy choices or assessments. But now we have really arrived in a world where the system simply cannot cope with so many crises at the same time. And we see now more and more entrenched groupthink. So all the various events that I've been recently, attending, there is just simply no willingness, particularly I would say in the West, to really entertain and seriously scenario plan for the massively disruptive scenarios, such as, for example, Trump winning the elections. Is anyone planning for it? In NATO, in the European Union, individual governments? No. Russia potentially reversing the war scenarios, and we're already seeing that happening again. We've had a massive groupthink around this idea that Ukraine is going to achieve a lot on the battlefield over the summer, even though, of course, questioning what the assumptions were around this proposition, I think, wasn't enough done. And now we created the situation in which the expectations were too over-optimistic, and we moved from this kind of excessive expectations towards kind of deflated expectations, a little bit what Preston has described. And there is now like a perception that we are sort of stuck and there is no, new thinking. And we have a number of crises, and I think Middle East is also one of them, where the worst case scenarios are simply not being substantially analyzed, and there is a very sadly dominance and prevalence of the groupthink within the policy world. And on the business side of things, I hear all the time from companies, from banks, that they're simply overloaded with a lot of crises happening at the same time, and too much risk, and there's no capacity to manage those risks. So the risks are managed selectively and perhaps not strategically enough. So this kind of risk overload, which really we do not have any solutions to, because we know that risks will be growing and multiplying. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Oksana. And before I give the floor to Erik for his opening remarks, I want to give a shout out to the representatives of the class of 2006 who are online with us today, and once more thank them for their support in keeping Janika Albers' memory alive. So Erik, you were part of setting up this this roundtable initially. Perhaps you also have something more to add on where this initiative came from, and then global world risks as well. Thanks a lot for being here.
No, thanks a lot, Veronica, and it's a great pleasure for me to be back at SAIS. I feel totally at home here, having taught in this building for 20 years. It feels a little weird not to be here, to be honest. And I'm also glad that Bob Singer has just come in. Bob was the inspiration for this whole risk initiative, and has remained a loyal supporter of the program since it was founded. The thing to know about Janika is Janika was my student, but she was also my colleague at Oxford Analytica, and she was one of the first guests that I invited to this seminar. So she was supposed to be presenting the work that she'd been doing at Oxford Analytica in the very first version of this seminar, where we were talking about political risk consulting to students. And quite tragically, about a week before the seminar met, she had a terrible car accident in Tunisia. And it was a huge shock to all of us, a terrible loss for us as a SAIS community, but also for Oxford Analytica. And the then CEO of Oxford Analytica, Nader Mousavizadeh, had actually supported me in creating this, and then lent a lot of support to the risk program. In addition, Janika is sorely missed. In keeping with the goal of this, what I want to do is to put a little, I've got to try to compete with these guys who actually know what's going on in the world. So I'm going to put a little jargon around it, and then it'll sound like I'm really smart. And I'm going to break the 5 risks that Veronica asked us to introduce down into theoretical categories rather than anywhere that you've ever heard of. But hopefully these theoretical categories will help you. I think the first risk that we have is the gatekeepers, right? You look at what happened in the Netherlands recently. It's not that Geert Wilders won the election. It's that the gatekeepers that were supposed to keep him out of power totally collapse, right? When the leaders of all your major political parties decide they're not going to stay in politics, then don't be surprised when the longest serving member of parliament leads his party to victory, right? I mean, the bottom line is that these populists are always there. It's just somebody has to keep the people who are trying to keep the institutions from functioning or to tear the institutions down at bay. I think we're going to see a very similar phenomenon in Belgium next June. And people are suddenly going to wake up and go, oh my goodness, Vlaams Belang has just emerged as the country's largest political party. Well, surprise, when the Christian Democrats and the Socialists and the Liberals discredit themselves over long periods of time of governing together, don't be amazed when the opposition comes to power, right? Because eventually that's what happens when the gatekeepers lose their influence. And I think that there are other situations where we're going to see that as well. Most tragically in Germany, if this coalition can hold together, we'll keep AfD, the alternative for Germany, at bay. But if it were to fall apart spectacularly, I think we'll see the news headlines dominated by stories about the emergence of the far right in Germany, where they should be talking about the collapse of the political center in Germany instead. And these things are important, and this is the second thing that I highlight as a risk, because of the impact that these groups have on collective action, right? I mean, collective action is what we rely on to control the world around us. And what we see in the Netherlands already is that the government is a demissionaire government, right? So a caretaker government, so it can't act. Right? The Spanish government had a very similar phenomenon for long periods of time, could not act. Turned out that was an important source of risk because the Dutch and the Spaniards were necessary to move forward a reform of macroeconomic policy coordination at the European level. They could not act. There was no reform. Now we're in a bad place. The German government is heading in that situation. They will not be able to act. And not having Germany act means not funding the war in Ukraine. It means not engaging in the kind of responsible macroeconomic policy that you would want to see. And this failure of collective action is not only at the national level and all these stories that I tell, but at the European level as well. Because when these countries can't act at the national level, how effective do you think they're going to be in the European Council? The European Council summit that's coming up on the 15th of December is not going to be a happy affair. On the contrary, it's going to be a very difficult one because there are too many demissionaire governments that are going into it, and there are too many other governments that simply can't act, like Germany, and that's going to be a problem. And this brings me to the third issue, which is distributive conflict. You know, it's not just politicians who act. Everybody else in society has the power to act as well. We use collective action to get them to act in coordination, but they're going to be uncoordinated. And we're going to see this particularly in wage bargaining because we have not conceded enough real wage stability to most of the people who are unionized in the working classes. And now they're getting organized to fight for higher wages to compensate for the inflation that they've experienced. And those higher wages are going to accelerate inflation. Again, this is the general expectation that's coming out of Isabel Schnabel at the European Central Bank. If that happens, then we're going to have a whole bunch of conversations about whether the central bank should be tightening even further or how long it's going to keep interest rates at a high level. And let's face it, our economies are not performing particularly well right now. So this distributive conflict, and let's face it, inflation is always about distributive conflict. This distributive conflict over inflation is going to create problems looking ahead, and we have to pay very close attention, I think, to that. That brings me to the fourth thing, which is nonlinear dynamics. Now, I know you guys all like to talk about nonlinear dynamics. But just think about things that happen really slowly and then really quickly, right? Or things that just seem to happen out of nowhere. Those are the two kinds of linear dynamics I'm worried about. One of them is attached to de-risking. De-risking is the phrase that everybody is using to describe how the world economy is being re-engineered in order to make us safer. That's going to take place really slowly. But through standards, it's going to propagate across these large global value chains. And we are going to find out really quickly at some point in the future that we live in two separate global economies, right? So really slowly and then really quickly. I think we need to start paying attention to the really slowly bit next year because we're going to start to see signs of it. It's not going to show up in the trade data. It's going to show up in the industrial standards. So look at industrial standards and look at the raw materials they use, and that will tell you what to bet on looking ahead. By the same token, things that are going to happen spontaneously are things like violent conflict, right? Let's face it, when you don't feel represented by your politicians because the gatekeepers have failed you, when there is no effective collective action, and when you're in the middle of distributive conflict and you're losing, the inclination to resort to violence is significant, right? If you want to understand what's happening in the Middle East right now, that's what happened. Right? A sudden resort to violence. If you want to understand what's going on in Ukraine right now, pay attention to this possibility for a sudden resort to violence. Because if this situation doesn't improve on the ground, it's not like the Ukrainians are going to go, oh, that's a bummer. I guess we lost 20% of our country. And it's not like they're going to look at their own political leaders and go, oh, that's a bummer. You tried really hard, but it didn't work. There's a real potential for a bunch of really stressed out people who are well armed and well trained to get really upset. And that potential exists in Ukraine, it exists in Russia. These are areas where Oksana is much more knowledgeable than I. But I think that this potential for violent conflict also exists in the United States. And I'm quite apprehensive about the potential for violent conflict to emerge around the upcoming US presidential elections, and we should pay attention to that. The fifth thing that I would highlight are combination stories, right? Where we get the gatekeepers failing, where we get collective action problems, where we get distributive conflict, and where we get nonlinear dynamics all at the same time. Now, these are complicated stories to tell, but I'll just give you one to give you a sense of the complexity, the one that has me most concerned. In Italy right now, we have a government of the people that the gatekeepers were supposed to keep out. And that government is trying its best actually to make the institutions function. But like the scorpion on the toad that's trying to cross the river, it's in their nature not to do that. We're going to go up to this European parliamentary elections in the spring. The likelihood that the Lega is going to turn on Meloni's brothers of Italy in the run-up to that election is relatively high. And as they show their true nature and begin to attack one another, we have to worry because there are lots of things that they should have done but couldn't, like ratifying the European Stability Mechanism Treaty, like engaging in rational macroeconomic policy or operating within a macroeconomic policy framework. And the reason that these things are important is because if they get in trouble, they need to have done these things in order to qualify for assistance from the European Central Bank. In order for the European Central Bank to step in and buy their bonds, either using the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program or using the Transmission Protection Instrument or using outright monetary transactions. Now, all of these safety guardrails that are supposed to be out there, Italy does not qualify for and cannot qualify for because it hasn't been able to make the decisions, which means that if the markets turn on Italy, just like political violence, market runs are nonlinear dynamics. If the markets turn on Italy, we will suddenly discover that Italy is the only one playing on the trapeze without a net because of the situation in which it finds itself. And this country could blow up in the bond markets as a consequence. I think that's a real risk. I really hope that doesn't happen. And I spend a lot of my time trying to convince people that it should not happen. But the biggest lesson from political risk analysis is that what you believe should be the course of action is not always the course of action because the world is not as rational as we would like it to be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erik. For everyone who is taking the risk course, you should be very familiar with all that theoretical referencing. So we've made you proud. And thanks so much for also giving us all these illustrations that we're going to get back to. I'm now going to turn the floor back to Keat for one, to Preston for one question. Related to your actually day-to-day activity. So we are interested also in knowing how do you deal with the kind of risks that you have set up for ourselves in the conversation while being a bank. So under the conditions of being a bank. So why does a bank care if NATO is not united? Why does a bank care if people are not dealing with climate change? And how do you even address these sort of things when you have just different kinds of interests than politicians?
Sure, well, I would say two basic methods that are somewhat technical. The first has to do with risk appetite for a given country. So we have an overall country limit. We have an exposure to a country. If we think that exposure is too high against that limit, or if we think the limit is just too high in general, then we'll reduce those things, right? So very little headroom between limit and exposure, which means any additional business or operations that would increase the limit get an extremely high degree of scrutiny, right? So, particularly in this current global environment that Erik and Oksana have described as, it's dangerous, right? So, your risk tolerance is has to be very sort of crystal clear, and you don't just casually say, oh, the business wants to do something big in this country and they think they can make a lot of money. It's like, no, we're very sort of risk aware, particularly in this environment. And I think the other thing that you do, this whole combinations of these different kinds of risks there. I mean, one of the things that we do is something called combined stress testing. So we envision scenarios where all these really bad things happen at the same time, right? And then we see what happens to our clients, what happens to our trading book, our banking book, et cetera. And we say, okay, what mitigants can we put in place? What kind of hedges can we put in place? What sort of limit reductions or just positions should we change? So there's there are just, let's say, multiple of these stress tests, a whole suite of them designed to stress different parts of the bank. And again, we have a couple of them which is your sort of your combinations of all of these. It's it's kind of our kitchen sink stress test where all the bad stuff happens at once. And do you have enough capital to survive in that context?
Thank you. And I of course you can answer also to each other. Now it's time to tell Preston he's wrong about Ukraine and Russia and everything, if you so feel inclined. But also I also want to know, how does it feel to be an independent consultant now that you don't have the team that would put together all the indicators and with all their different knowledge and understanding of the world from multiple points of view. How does that change the way that you do research, for example?
Oh gosh, that's a complicated question. I mean, I guess, for me now, I sort of went back to my comfort zone, sort of the areas that I really interested in and follow very closely and always follow closely when I worked in a big company, I didn't always have a chance to follow what I really was interested in and I guess what my relative strength is. So I still work very much on scenarios, and this is something that I want to continue working a lot more on, developing methodologies and various approaches to thinking about scenario analysis, but geographically, of course, very much focusing on Europe and the region around it, and there's plenty of risks that are happening in that part of the world. I'm also really glad that I have now finally a chance to go back to the policy world, because actually what I found when I arrived to the private sector from the policy world, particularly being kind of in Europe, I suppose, is that there is really not as much cross kind of fertilization in understanding and thinking between the policy world and business. And I think it is really unfortunate that we are still in that situation. I think in the United States, because of this revolving door policy and a lot of people, key decision makers moving between the private sector and public sector quite a lot throughout their careers, there is much more kind of appreciation, understanding, and openness to kind of try to see the world from both public and private sector perspective. While in Europe, I found quite worryingly, it is not the case. For example, if you look at specifically Russia sanctions, something that I do very closely on a daily basis, in the United States, there is much more of a kind of understanding, I think, from OFAC and the Treasury Department, that there is a kind of legitimate concern that the sanctions that we impose on Russia should be primarily impacting Russia, not so much Western business. So there is a willingness and an interest to minimize the unintended consequences, and also try to work very closely with business to try to kind of collect and understand intelligence and information about how sanctions really work. Because at the end of the day, people who are in the real world, so to speak, and they know and understand much more how the various loopholes are emerging, how the circumvention schemes are emerging, because it's an extremely dynamic process. While in Europe, the situation is different. I think there is no recognition from governments that there is a legitimate interest of minimizing impact on business in many ways, because the sanctions that EU is imposing, and of course we are now in this incredible environment when the EU did collectively agree on quite unprecedented and enormous, package of sanctions in Russia, which is also impacting European companies quite substantially. But because essentially any decision on sanctions within the EU is a kind of collective bargaining, is a negotiations among national interests, that are based on, of course, eventually compromise, that whenever you take that decision and you think, okay, it's not working perfectly, you cannot go back and just change and fine tune one element, because you have to reopen the entire compromise, because then if you take out one element, then other parts of the collective bargain is not going to hold. So as a result of it, we have a situation in which quite a lot of sanctions are simply not working as much as we were hoping for. And therefore, if we look at Russia now, I mean, the IMF has just upgraded the economic growth forecast. I mean, Russian economy is growing at the rate of about 2% GDP, and despite of all the kind of sanctions that were imposed. So again, I'm really glad being now in a space where I'm able to actually, again, be very much, go between an interpreter of kind of what business is thinking about that and what the public policy world is thinking about it, and be kind of synthesizer of those approaches, which I think is an important role to play. But on Preston, just one point. I mean, I agree, and I think his points are very much something that I certainly share, with exception of one thing about the Democratic Party feeling good about themselves. I don't know. I mean, all my conversations with the Democratic Party in the US is that there's quite a lot of concerns, but maybe you know something better than me.
What do you know, Preston?
I was trying to be dispassionate. All of my friends who are Democrats are panicked and think they should get a new candidate and all this kind of thing. Yeah, I was trying to take the longer view of a pollster.
Yeah, all right.
Actually, I want to give Oksana and a little more airtime because we don't have enough female voices here at SAIS. So let's just, you mentioned war as being something that we're going to normalize. And we have so many ways to look at war more and more. And we know that it's there. And but do you think that we are adapting? Do you think that this world is functioning right now, trying to upgrade the status quo, or are we just all aiming at some form of equilibrium, some form of familiarity, and we're actually not prepared for the things that are going to come at us with the fury that Erik described as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are like, the world is like a car, which is, going downhill with no brakes or brakes broken, because we're really going back to gatekeepers. I mean, at a global scale, I think we have lost the gatekeepers. We have lost the global governance instruments that work. I mean, look at the UN. The Security Council is not able to address any of the major kind of even ongoing wars, let alone preventing new ones from emerging. And I think next year that's potentially another risk. I mean, it's a big make or break for global governance, because we now have enough of the mega crisis that the UN or other global governance institutions simply were not able to tackle. I mean, remember OSCE, the institution which was created to address European security challenges in an inclusive fashion, and precisely now, because it is inclusive, it is not able to address anything, because it is functioning on the basis of consensus. And at the same time, we also don't have any other kind of constraints that would have been associated, for example, with countries, being concerned about going to war, because that would be something which will backfire substantially on their economies. I mean, look at both Israel and Russia, and I think the wars are actually drivers in their view of kind of for different reasons. It's two very different wars, and I'm not by any means trying to kind of draw an equivalence, but I'm just saying that the war is not seen as a source of economic collapse. The reason why Russia is growing at 2% GDP, because they were able to adapt very quickly to creating the war economy and creating other sources of growth in the environment of this fragmentation, where perhaps those kind of state-led sources of growth were needed anyway. So again, those kind of guardrails, that were in the past preventing wars from emerging, are now gone, and we have enough of a drivers which will be able to spark those. And again, it's not just Europe and Middle East. It's South Asia, I mean, Taiwan, I mean, a lot of concerns about that, and many other parts of the world. And we just simply do not have any instruments to be able to manage and prevent that. And it's very worrying. And I don't really see in any foreseeable future those instruments emerging. Perhaps we are 10, 20 years away from, any new kind of initiative, which could actually be seen both in developing new set of principles, kind of terms and conditions of the world in which the big powers can agree on, and then on top of that, then developing institutions and structures that can implement those principles.
As a fellow Eastern European, I definitely share the doom and gloom, which is also characteristic of our types. So yeah, it's quite distressing to think of all of these things. And I'm not going to ask Erik how he does his research, as I should know that. But I am going to try to cheer up this conversation a little bit by also trying to figure out if you could see any mitigating factors in these combined world risks that you've identified for us. Do you see any? Could be too short of an answer, and then I have another question if the answer is no. But if you see any kind of inspiration coming from any direction. I know you work on Ukraine. I just came from Ukraine myself. We work on a joint project. Do you find the European Union is moving into a more supportive direction or a more adaptive direction there?
I want to. You asked for good news, so I'll give you the good news. The good news is that the Chinese military is now talking to the U.S. military again. The bad news is that they weren't talking, right? I mean, that's kind of terrifying when you look at the amount of interaction that the United States and China has in the South China Sea, the fact that they weren't talking was deeply disturbing. The fact that they are talking is much more reassuring. Whether that builds into something more positive remains to be seen, but you know, baby steps, that's pretty good. The issue with the European Union is that, you know, right now there is a big cleavage running through the European Council. And the big cleavage is between those who believe that enlargement should be viewed through the lens of a security imperative, that the European Union must grow if it's going to stabilize the European continent. And those who believe that enlargement should be viewed through the lens of transformational change, right? So countries have to change themselves to adapt to the key communautaire of the European Union. It's a long time consuming process. They have to modify their political institutions to meet the political requirements. Another long and time consuming process. But at the end, they become transformed, these countries, into the kinds of stable democracies that we see in Belgium and the Netherlands and places like that, right? Which was a joke. And that cleavage between the transformational view of enlargement, which is very slow, and the security imperative view of enlargement, which is very quick, right? Is the thing that needs to get resolved on December the 15th, right? When the European Council meets, they're going to have to make a choice, and they're going to try to fudge it and say, we're going to choose to do some kind of staggered accession. But if you're doing a staggered accession according to the logic of the security imperative, it's irreversible and it accelerates, right? And if you're doing it in the other way, then it's just a giant waiting room. So I think we have to be very attentive to how the language comes out, and there could be really good green shoots that comes out of that story, or we could be seeing more of the same that the Western Balkans has experienced for the last 20 years.
Okay, I would like to open the floor for more questions from the audience, and not before I also tell the people online that they are welcome to write their questions in the Q&A. And it's also a good time to acknowledge the presence of prospective candidates at SAIS. We've been going through some grueling interviews, but I see them online now, and I hope that this is a good show of what we're doing here as well. So it's great to see you online. Okay, so we'll collect questions from the audience, and then we'll be reading the ones online.
Hello, my name is Theo. I'm part of the Global Risk Program. Thank you all so much for being here. So I guess I have a question, since being a risk analyst also is sort of finding the worst case scenarios in current world events. I was wondering, what are some of the risks that you anticipated, which were going to be detrimental, which ultimately didn't turn out the way that you thought they would?
Do we leave some more time for them to think of questions? Who wants to take that one? Self-awareness moment. It's time to do.
So the question was risks that you forecast that didn't materialize?
We were wrong.
You know, in this business, you're wrong roughly half the time, right? So, I think one of the interesting things, I'm not evading your question. I think one of the interesting things about, risks that matter, particularly in capital markets, are that, so the question of who will win the next US election is material and it matters. The question of who will win the next Russian election is a foregone conclusion, right? So it doesn't it matters, but in a different way in terms of forecasting. So I would say that, for the things that matter, they're almost always close to 50-50. That matter in terms of moving markets. If there's an awareness of a certain outcome, then that outcome's already priced in, right? So it's the things that are close that are the most interesting, and also the hardest to forecast because they're close, right? So I think, analytically what you need to do is explain what your base case is, and why you think that's going to happen, and then explain why you might be wrong, right? And as long as you're wrong for the right reasons, you can sort of maintain your credibility. So I'll go back to the 2016 election, right? So our base case was that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And we thought about, okay, why might that not happen? And we said, well, if polling errors are correlated across 5 or 6 swing states, so they're wrong for they'll be off for similar reasons across multiple states. That's your pathway to a Trump victory, you know, and we sort of go through what that checklist looked like. So we completely got the forecast wrong, but we had explained under what circumstances we would be wrong. So I mean, I think that's the, you know, for people in a risk class, you know, it's fine to be wrong as long as you're explaining what the pathway to your non-base case outcome is.
Erik wants to take a step.
I mean, 2016 was like a cornucopia of bad bets, right? In the worst,
wrong too. Sorry.
the worst prediction I made, I was talking to a journalist from Politico, and the question wasn't who was going to win the U.S. elections, because we all agreed that Hillary was going to win, right? The question was, what would happen in the markets if Donald Trump won? And I thought through, you know, everything I'd learned in monetary economics and everything I'd seen in financial market performance. And I said, well, if Donald Trump won, since that would be such a surprise, and since the economic policies that he'd put forward was such a melange of very strange things, and they were mixed in with some social and political things that looked kind of frightening, I thought there'll be a run on the dollar, right? People will want to move their money somewhere else. And I was right for about 5 seconds. I can show you in the US dollar exchange rate when it dropped precipitously. And then everyone in the world basically said, hey, this guy's really going to cut taxes, and pushed into the dollar with amazing speed and strength, and led to a huge stock market boom at the same time. And if you look, you can find people mocking me on Google. Just look hard enough, right? It's not hard for me since I can find them so easily. But you know, I had just never paid attention to the fact that the people who were going to make the bets were actually working with much smaller models than I was working with. I had a model that included all these political variables and the people who were making the bets had a model that had one variable, right? What is the future tax rate going to be, right? And that's what they focused on. So, you know, remember that the people that you are making bets about are people that could be using very different heuristics from your own. And if you don't know what heuristic they're using, then you might be cautious about how strongly you want to make that bet.
So we're going to collect one question from the room, and as we do that, I have a question for Oksana from Richard Muno online, giving you the opportunity to perhaps be wrong or right in the future. What do you think the prospects are for regime change in Russia over the next year or so under the pressures of the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, I mean, I famously at this event here at SAIS, you know, failed to predict could not predict the call to call, you know, the Russia's invasion, right? So I didn't believe that was, you know, of course, 6 months before Putin decided to start the full-scale war. I didn't believe that he will do it, but you know, now I guess I don't see any signs at all that the regime is under stress. In fact, the regime is now more stronger and stable than it has been for a very long time, because it kind of implemented now very, you know, huge repressions that there is no kind of external opposition. So all the people who were opposed to the war left, more or less, the country, or in jail at the moment. The economy is not doing badly, so he's still able to source a lot of resources. And of course, the propaganda has been incredibly effective in kind of shaping the public perception of this war. I mean, in Russia, the absolute majority of people see this war as a defensive war, that Russia is defending itself against the Western aggression. And of course, that's, not true, but it doesn't matter what is true, what is not. It is, what people perceive. So in that sense, I mean, I do not see any prospects at all for this regime to be destabilized, either within or without. Now, of course, the big question is, what happens if something happens to Putin? And there's various rumors circulating online about his death or his illness, etc. Again, looking at it from a kind of more systemic regime perspective, I mean, I think at this stage, it is hard to imagine that even if there will be change at the top, that there will be a very substantial new regime to emerge, So I think probably for a very long time, this regime is going to be relatively stable, which of course is a major challenge to not only to Europe, but I think to global order.
Okay, so you talked about rising support of policies and parties further on the right in terms of the failure of the center and the left as gatekeepers. But I know quite a few young people in the United States who are genuinely excited about conservative ideas, not because they're the last option or something like this. And so I'm curious what your analysis is of why political attitudes, specifically conservative attitudes, are spreading among young people in the United States and also other places in the world relatively quickly and with a lot of enthusiasm.
And certainly had a question. That was addressed to you.
Thank you. It's not so much a question of commiseration with Oksana, because I was also in the camp in the run up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where I simply could not believe that it would happen. And simply this was for reasons that we've discussed, that it didn't seem rational, and yet the world becomes sometimes quite irrational. But the comment I had is about just how difficult it is sometimes to predict change. It is so much easier to predict that nothing will change. In other words, there's continuity. And so even today, we're talking about continuity. Yeah, well, Putin drops dead, there's going to be continuity, or at least they'll pull out another Putin from somewhere. It was also the same during the Cold War, when there was a distinct failure to predict change, certainly in the United States among analysts with regard to changes in the Soviet Union. There was, and even when Gorbachev came around, there was a view very high in the, very high up in the levels of the US government, where people just thought that Gorbachev was not a real thing, that he was trying to dupe the United States, and that in the end, nothing would change. And of course, that proved fundamentally wrong in the short term. But what's interesting? It may have been right in the long term, if you kind of reflect on this. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, yes, predicting change is extremely difficult because it seems very unlikely. But if you look back, across history, what you can see is long-term trends, and those long-term trends, they speak for themselves, but they can also be challenged, like we have in the 1980s. So that's just a thought.
Quick reaction to that: how do you predict change when change is the context? So that's always a difficult one. Bob,
yeah, I mean, is the issue predicting what will happen, or is the issue understanding what could happen and then deciding how you're going to deal with it at that point? And the reason, and I think the two kinds of things that you were talking about. So you're talking about elections. When there's an election, something will happen. And so if I think about the two elections, they were both decided by an extremely de minimis number of people. Hillary Clinton lost by fewer than 100,000 votes. That's a statistically demonstrable thing in 3 cities where enough Black people didn't go out and vote for her. It's that simple. Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit. That's why she lost. Biden won exactly because the marginal number of people in those places went out and voted for him. And I don't agree, but
electorally they won.
So I'm just thinking, so those are extremely difficult things to predict. Okay, so that, and so is it really critical? I mean, it's to try to predict it and much more, and I think about what you said before about 50-50. On the other hand, there's two wars, where, I mean, it's really being aware of what could happen, and obviously in Israel, they truly messed up, right? I mean, they hadn't, if they had any inkling, they would have had some troops there to protect their people, right? I mean, this is drastically horrible, and so I just wonder there as well. Do you just know that something sooner or later will happen? It's not predicting when it will happen. It's just understanding that you have to be able to deal with it when it does, as a risk exercise.
Thank you, Bob. So you're really eager to answer that one,
I mean,
okay? Then conservative politics, and also prediction, if you want to add something. And we also have the question from Sergey.
Yeah, so I think in political risk terms, right, there are these elections, which are often quite close, and that's the one that's too hard to call, et cetera, et cetera. But right, I think much of effective risk management is understanding what could happen with, I don't know, let's say 10 or 20% plus probability, and then thinking about what you will do about it, right? So getting right or wrong in prediction of whether Russia is going to invade Ukraine almost doesn't matter, because it was certainly quite plausible, and they were amassing all these troops. So 4 months before they go in, what do? You risk manage all your positions, you provision, et cetera, et cetera. So I think from our perspective, it wasn't whether we thought it was a yes or no, or how big or small the invasion would be. It was, is there a pretty good chance it will happen? Yes. So do something about it, and and if it doesn't happen, you're also fine. So I think a lot of effective risk management goes like, and you get some pretty extreme things that are thrown out there, and to those you have to say, well, that doesn't actually seem very plausible, so let's not waste our time on that. So it's often like the thing is it 5% or is it 20%? And so it's making that call rather than the 50-51%, which is just as important, I think.
Yes, I guess for me, because I work a lot on scenarios, so I always say that, you should not obsess about predictions, because what is important about scenario, if you're a good scenario forecaster, you develop, alternative plausible ways, and even if they are not likely, you at least, for the purposes of your stress testing, you know what are the potential, alternative pathways, and you prepare for them all. But I guess why we all are concerned about it, because we just lived through several years where very, very binary, events have really fundamentally changed the course of history. Look at Brexit, look at Trump, look at Putin's invasion, and they are so binary, so that you kind of like, you walk into the boardroom nowadays, and the first question you get, so what is the next big thing? As if it's like there is only one thing that you need to be worried about, but actually the whole trends that we were just describing here, are already pointing very clearly towards a particular direction here, and I mean, on Sergey's point, I totally agree. I mean, I think, even more interesting point is that Gorbachev himself didn't know what he was doing actually is going to deliver that outcome. He himself didn't predict his own, he was actually somebody who came in with explicit intention of improving socialism, right? He was a socialist. He wanted to improve the socialism, and he wanted to, create this. He didn't at all intend to kind of destroy, collapse the country, lead to this, market economy of the extreme. So sometimes even the policymakers, do not know. I agree with you. I mean, we don't really know for sure. And of course, it would be presumptuous to think that for sure we know that nothing will change. I mean, things might change completely. But I think on a kind of, summary of factors that we are watching at the moment, I think it's just very hard to see that the regime is going to be, dramatically changing. At the same time, personalist regimes like Putin's regime also cannot be the same when the person dies, right? So it will be anyway a different regime. Just the question is whether it's going to be a democratic one or just this authoritarian.
Like full disclaimer, we do obsess about prediction and risk at SAIS and in scenario building as well. So just so you know that it does matter, and we put a lot of effort into getting those things right. Erik.
So the thing about young people and conservative values, I think these value shifts ebb and flow, right? The first stories I told about the gatekeepers failing were stories about the post-68 period, where the gatekeepers failed to keep very left-leaning young people out of power, right? There's some really good sociology about that period and the impact that had and created a crisis of governance in the 1970s that took many years to get over. The fact that the gatekeepers are letting people in on the right now is purely conditional on the domestic political environment. And so I wouldn't dare to tell a story about why young people are embracing more conservative values. The thing that worries me is why anyone would embrace values that want to prevent democratic institutions from functioning or break those institutions entirely, right? So when I look at the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, I'm less impressed by his conservative values in terms of religion and sexuality and social norms than I'm struck by his strong belief that the election was stolen in 2020 and the efforts that he made in order to try to overturn that electoral outcome. And I think that's what the gatekeepers should be keeping at bay, right? And I can tell you little stories about the kind of way people miscalculate that. My favorite is everybody thought Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands was on the right. I mean, he was not on the right. He was his own thing, right? And yet he was still dangerous to get into power because of what he could do to the institutions, and his political party did that. Bob, on your point, I think I work a lot with portfolio managers, and portfolio managers need a prediction, and they want a prediction, and they want a point estimate, and they want a standard deviation so that they know how much variation in the point estimate they should build into their models, because they have to make a bet, right? Having said that, I was very struck by Ray Dalio's last book. Ray Dalio is the founder and manager of Bridgewater, which was the largest macro hedge fund. Ray Dalio's last book was all about looking at the past in order to understand what could happen, not what will happen, but what could happen. Because he was managing such large asset portfolios, his goal was to simply to structure them in ways that did exactly as you said, that paid attention to what could happen, and if it's a really bad thing, hedged against that prospect.
So as it always happens, a lot of the questions are coming towards the end. So I just want to finish with one that probably is addressed. I mean, it is addressed to everyone. From Sophia Amgarian online, to both independent and corporate analysts. What are the trade-offs between being an area or policy specialist versus a generalist, and what are your recommendations for aspiring analysts?
I'm most certainly in the camp of area specialists. I think the era of generalists is over in many ways, because we are now living in a world where sort of homogeneity across the world, which was supposed to come as a result of this what Preston called hyper-globalization, is over. We are now see much more fragmentation with its own standards, with its own rules, with its own dynamics, and I think you really you will be much better off to be an expert, and that's why I'm sort of crusading for so many years now about US political science field, where the area studies were somehow considered to be less important than comparativist, political science. And I think that we have now gone back where we need to start teaching much more, area studies, because that's where the world is going.
Yeah, I would just say briefly that most of the successful political and country risk managers that I've worked with, trained, et cetera, have started off as a let's say an SME, subject matter expert, area studies expert, speak languages, have local networks and knowledge and things like that. I would say that in addition to that, there are, I think, more macro skills which are becoming more relevant. So all kinds of data analysis, data visualization. And I think literally just in the last 2 years, IR theory is now a thing, and deterrence theory is a thing, which I hadn't thought about that since undergrad, and now it's like super relevant again. So I think, these things go in cycles and waves, and some of these generalist skills are suddenly useful in the last 18 months.
So, I ran the European and Eurasian Studies program for more than a decade, so I'm not gonna argue against knowing something. The line we used to use is you've got to know something about somewhere if you're gonna know anything about anywhere, right? So I think you should do that. Having said that, the best answer to that question is in the form of a book by Graham Hurd called Understanding Russian Strategic Behavior. It was published in February of 22. In other words, right at the same time that the full-scale invasion took place. And it basically tells you the Russian mindset, and it's not cutting-edge research, it's a big synthesis of where the Russian studies community was going. It tells you the Russian mindset in a way that helps you better to understand why we were so mistaken in believing that this full-scale invasion would not take place. And the fact that it anticipated the full-scale invasion suggests that maybe if we'd done more Russian studies, we would have been in a better position.
So very unfortunate, we have to leave it at that for this evening. I am extremely grateful for our panel to our panel for keeping this tradition alive, and particularly to the Bologna class of 2006 for helping us keep Janika Albers' memory alive. And I unfortunately, these panels are never happy, so it's very hard to end them on a happy note. It is our job as political risk analysts to digest the horrors of the world, and I think that we've done that quite well this evening. So please join me in thanking our panel for having been here with us tonight, and yeah, good luck at dealing with this going forward. I do apologize to everyone online for not having gotten to all your questions.